The alarm pierces through the silence. Your eyes open to the familiar ceiling. And in that first, unguarded moment before consciousness fully takes hold, something happens that will define everything that follows. You feel it immediately. That first emotion that washes over you as reality settles in. For some, it's a familiar weight, a quiet voice whispering, "Not again." The day ahead feels like a burden to be endured, another cycle in an endless wheel of obligations and disappointments. For others, there's something different, a spark of curiosity, perhaps even anticipation. What's possible today? This isn't just about being a morning person or having had enough coffee. This moment, this very first emotional response to existence itself, reveals something profound about how you see life. And whether you realize it or not, you're participating in the most fundamental philosophical battle in human history. Should we say yes to life? To all of it. The suffering and the joy, the meaning and the meaninglessness, the beauty and the horror? Or is existence itself a condition we're better off recognizing as fundamentally flawed? The numbers tell a disturbing story. Rates of existential anxiety are climbing. Depression touches nearly 1 in 5 adults. We live in the most materially prosperous era in human history, yet surveys reveal a crisis of meaning that spans generations. People are asking more than ever, what's the point? 2 German philosophers, separated by a generation, gave radically different answers to this question. One believed that life was suffering, that desire was an endless torment, and that the wisest response was a kind of elegant withdrawal from the whole painful game. The other looked at this philosophy and called it the greatest slander against existence itself, a cowardly no masquerading as wisdom. Their battle wasn't fought in universities or lecture halls. It was fought in the depths of the human psyche, where we all must eventually choose. Do we affirm this strange, difficult, magnificent experience of being alive? Or do we quietly, philosophically, turn away? This is the story of the most important philosophical war you've never heard of. And by the end, you'll realize it's the war that's been raging in your own mind every morning, every difficult day, every moment you've wondered whether any of this is worth it. The question isn't academic, it's urgent, it's personal, and your answer is already shaping how you live. Frankfurt, 1788. A boy is born into a world that will teach him, with methodical cruelty, that existence is suffering. Arthur Schopenhauer's childhood reads like a case study in philosophical determinism. His father, Heinrich, was a successful merchant, but a domineering presence who saw life as a series of brutal competitions to be won or endured. His mother, Johanna, was intellectually brilliant but emotionally cold. She would later become a successful novelist, but she showed little affection for her son. When Arthur was 17, his father either jumped or fell to his death from their house. The circumstances remained forever unclear, but the message was unmistakable. Even successful people find life unbearable. Young Schopenhauer traveled through Europe as part of his merchant training, and everywhere he looked, he saw the same patterns. In London's factories, he watched workers ground down by endless labor. In the drawing rooms of Paris, he observed the wealthy consumed by petty jealousies and social anxieties. Suffering, he began to realize, wasn't a bug in the system of human existence. It was the feature. But Schopenhauer wasn't content to merely observe human misery. He was determined to understand why it was inevitable, and his answer would shake the foundations of Western thought. Picture reality as a vast theater, he said. On stage, you see the play of existence, people striving, loving, fighting, achieving, losing. It all seems to have purpose and meaning. But Schopenhauer asked us to look behind the curtain, to the machinery that drives the entire production. There, he claimed, you would find something terrible and magnificent. The will. Not your individual willpower. That's just a tiny manifestation of something much larger. Schopenhauer's will is the blind, insatiable force that drives all existence. It's what makes the planets orbit the sun, what drives animals to hunt and reproduce, what makes you reach for your phone when you're bored. It's the thing in itself that Kant said we could never know, except Schopenhauer claimed he had found it. And here's the horrifying truth. The will wants nothing but its own continuation. It has no ultimate purpose, no final satisfaction, no moment when it says enough. It simply wants and wants and wants. You are not separate from this will. You are its embodiment. Every desire you feel, every goal you pursue, every moment of dissatisfaction or restlessness is the cosmic will expressing itself through your individual existence. You think you want that promotion, that relationship, that perfect vacation. But these are just the will's mechanisms for ensuring its own perpetuation. Life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and boredom. Schopenhauer wrote, and these two are in fact its ultimate constituents. Think about your smartphone for a moment. The notification arrives, a small spike of anticipation. You check it, feel a brief moment of satisfaction, then nothing. Within seconds, you're unconsciously hoping for the next notification. You achieve the goal, get the thing you wanted, and the satisfaction evaporates so quickly you wonder if it was ever real. Then the cycle begins again with a new desire, a new dissatisfaction, a new reaching towards something that promises to fill the void, but never does.
This wasn't ancient wisdom to Schopenhauer. This was cutting-edge insight into the mechanics of human psychology. He was describing what we now call the hedonic treadmill, a century before psychologists had a name for it. But if the will is blind and insatiable, if suffering is built into the very structure of existence, what could possibly be the solution?
Schopenhauer found his answer in the most unlikely places. In art galleries, where people stood transfixed before beautiful paintings, temporarily forgetting their own wants and needs. In concert halls, where music, which he called the direct objectification of the will itself, lifted listeners out of their individual striving into something universal. And most radically, in the teachings of Buddhism and the examples of Christian mystics who had achieved something almost unthinkable, the complete denial of the will to live. The saint, the ascetic, the person who has seen through the illusion of individual existence and chosen to stop wanting altogether, this was Schopenhauer's hero, not the successful businessman, or the great lover, or the military conqueror, but the one who had said no to the entire game. His philosophy spread like a slow-burning fire through the minds of the 19th century's greatest artists and thinkers. Wagner composed operas based on Schopenhauerian themes of renunciation and redemption. Tolstoy read him and wrote, "The world as will and representation changed his entire understanding of life." Freud acknowledged that Schopenhauer had anticipated many of his insights into the unconscious drives that motivate human behavior. For decades, this bleak but compelling vision gathered followers. The philosopher of pessimism had diagnosed something that millions of people felt but couldn't articulate: the sense that existence itself might be a kind of cosmic mistake, a blind process that creates consciousness only to torture it with unfulfillable desires. But philosophy, like life, doesn't end with a single voice. In 1865, a young classical philology student wandered into a used bookshop in Leipzig. He was 21 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and struggling with questions about the meaning of existence that his religious upbringing could no longer answer. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche, and he was about to discover a book that would change everything. The world as will and representation hit him like lightning. Here, finally, was a philosopher who didn't offer easy comfort or false hope, who looked at suffering and called it what it was. For the next several years, Nietzsche would consider himself a devoted disciple of the great pessimist. He would call Schopenhauer his first and only educator, the thinker who had the courage to tell the truth about existence. But disciples, especially brilliant ones, have a dangerous habit of thinking for themselves. The bookshop in Leipzig was stuffy and cramped, filled with the musty smell of old paper and forgotten ideas. But when the young Friedrich Nietzsche opened "The World as Will and Representation," something electric happened. Here was a philosopher who didn't flinch from the darkness, who looked at suffering and named it honestly. "I belong to Schopenhauer," Nietzsche would later write. For years, he carried the master's teachings like a sacred text. In letters to friends, he praised Schopenhauer as his genius mentor, the only thinker brave enough to reject the comfortable lies that most philosophers peddled. His first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, was pure Schopenhauerian doctrine. Greek tragedy, Nietzsche argued, was humanity's greatest achievement because it stared directly into the horror of existence, the meaningless suffering, the inevitable death, the cosmic indifference, and transformed it into something beautiful. Art as temporary escape from the will, exactly as his teacher had prescribed. But something was stirring in the young philosopher's mind, a question that would eventually destroy his devotion and birth an entirely new way of seeing existence. What if Schopenhauer's pessimism wasn't the truth about life? What if it was the truth about Schopenhauer? The break didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, painful, like watching a beloved parent reveal themselves to be deeply flawed. Nietzsche began to see his master's philosophy not as objective description, but as psychological symptom. Schopenhauer's doctrine, he would eventually write, is the expression of a declining, exhausted life. This was philosophical heresy, but Nietzsche was just getting started. He began to argue that pessimism itself was a choice, not a discovery, but a decision. Schopenhauer hadn't uncovered the fundamental nature of reality. He had projected his own weariness, his own inability to say yes to existence, onto the cosmos itself. The will to nothingness that Schopenhauer prescribed was still a will, just a negating, life-denying one. But here's where Nietzsche's own suffering became his laboratory. Unlike Schopenhauer, who retreated into scholarly isolation and aesthetic contemplation, Nietzsche was forced to live with chronic illness, poverty, and social rejection. His headaches were so severe that he could barely work. His books were ignored. His personal relationships crumbled. By any reasonable measure, he had more cause for pessimism than his comfortable predecessor. Instead, he chose transformation. "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati," he wrote. "That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it." Amor fati, love of fate. Not just accepting what happens to you, but loving it as necessary, as the exact conditions required for you to become who you are meant to be. Consider someone you know who has been through devastating loss, perhaps the death of a child, or a diagnosis that changed everything, or a betrayal that shattered their understanding of trust. Now imagine that person, years later, saying something that sounds almost impossible. "I wouldn't change it. That experience, horrible as it was, made me who I am today. It taught me what really matters. It showed me strengths I never knew I had. I am grateful for it." This wasn't mere acceptance or resignation. This was active love of the very experiences that broke them open. This was amor fati in practice. But Nietzsche had an even more radical thought experiment. He called it the eternal recurrence, and it was designed to be the ultimate test of life affirmation. What if someday or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more"? Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? Every joy, but also every humiliation, every triumph, but also every failure, every moment of love, but also every heartbreak, every second of boredom, every petty frustration, every time you felt stupid or ashamed or lost. All of it, infinite times, in exactly the same sequence. Would you curse the demon or thank them? This wasn't a metaphysical claim about the nature of time. Nietzsche didn't literally believe in eternal recurrence. It was a psychological litmus test. Your answer reveals whether you are fundamentally saying yes or no to existence itself. Schopenhauer would have called the demon's proposal the cruelest torture imaginable. Nietzsche called it the highest possible affirmation of life. From this foundation, Nietzsche built a philosophy that was Schopenhauer's exact opposite. Where his teacher saw the will as blind suffering, Nietzsche saw will to power, not domination over others, but the creative force of growth, self-overcoming, the drive to become more than what you are. Where Schopenhauer praised the saint who renounced desire, Nietzsche envisioned the Übermensch, not a biological Superman, but a psychological and spiritual achievement. The person who creates their own values, who says yes to becoming, who transforms suffering into strength rather than seeking escape from it. "What does not kill me makes me stronger," he wrote. But this wasn't just a motivational slogan. It was a description of a psychological mechanism he saw operating throughout nature and human experience. Muscles grow stronger when stressed. Immune systems develop through exposure to challenges. Creativity often emerges from constraint. What looks like adversity can become the raw material for transcendence. Nietzsche looked at his former teacher's carefully constructed system and delivered a devastating verdict. Schopenhauer's philosophy is a nihilistic overthrow of values, a denial of life hiding behind the mask of philosophical wisdom. The master pessimist, Nietzsche argued, was actually the ultimate nihilist. By declaring existence meaningless and advocating withdrawal from it, Schopenhauer was committing philosophical suicide. He was choosing nothingness over the difficult work of creating meaning. He was saying no to the very conditions that make greatness, beauty, and transformation possible. The desire for destruction, change, becoming, Nietzsche wrote, can be the expression of overflowing energy pregnant with the future. But it can also be the hatred of the misdeveloped, destitute, underprivileged. Which was Schopenhauer? The wise sage who saw through life's illusions, or the exhausted pessimist who couldn't bear the weight of existence? Nietzsche had made his choice. Now he would spend the rest of his philosophical career building a philosophy based on the most radical premise imaginable, that we should say yes to life not despite its suffering, but because suffering is the price of everything valuable: growth, creativity, love, meaning itself. The student had become the ultimate critic. The battle was joined. Turn on your phone, open any social media app, scroll for 60 seconds and you'll witness the Schopenhauer-Nietzsche battle playing out in real time across millions of minds. Here's a post about climate change with comments full of "we're all doomed anyway" fatalism. There's a motivational quote about choosing your response to adversity, followed by dozens of eye-roll emojis from people who find such optimism naive or insulting. Over here, someone shares their struggle with depression, and the responses split predictably. Some offer Nietzschean encouragement about growth through suffering. Others provide Schopenhauerian comfort about the universality of pain. This isn't ancient philosophy. This is the intellectual battlefield of the 21st century, and you're living on it whether you realize it or not. The new pessimists aren't hard to find. They've organized themselves into online communities with names like antinatalism, where hundreds of thousands of people gather to discuss an idea that would have made Schopenhauer proud. That birth is always a harm, that bringing new conscious beings into existence is an act of cruelty. David Benatar, a philosophy professor at the University of Cape Town, has given this ancient insight modern rigor. In Better Never to Have Been, he argues with mathematical precision that the balance of suffering over pleasure in any human life makes existence a net negative. Every baby born, he claims, is guaranteed to experience pain, disappointment, disease, and death. The moments of joy don't compensate, they merely distract. The logic is seductive in its clarity. Scroll through the forums where these ideas flourish, and you'll find people who sound remarkably like Schopenhauer himself. I see what others can't bear to see. Life is suffering, and the kindest thing we can do is stop the cycle. Climate anxiety has become another vector for cosmic pessimism. What's the point of having children when the world is ending? Why pursue career goals when civilization is collapsing? Why try to improve anything when we're headed for ecological catastrophe? The paralysis is real. Young people report feeling hopeless about the future in numbers that would have alarmed even Schopenhauer. We are watching entire generations embrace a sophisticated form of civilizational despair that treats engagement with life as either naive or morally questionable. The data seems to support the pessimists. Despite unprecedented material prosperity, rates of depression and anxiety continue climbing, particularly in developed nations. Deaths of despair, suicide, overdose, alcohol-related disease have become a statistical category. We have more comfort, more entertainment, more options than any generation in history, yet surveys consistently show declining happiness and life satisfaction. Schopenhauer would have recognized this paradox immediately. The more the will achieves its desires, the more clearly we see that achievement brings no lasting peace. The hedonic treadmill he described is now documented in thousands of psychological studies. We get what we want, feel briefly satisfied, then return to baseline dissatisfaction remarkably quickly. Our culture has become obsessed with darkness in ways that would fascinate and disturb Schopenhauer. True crime podcasts dominate the charts. Dystopian narratives fill our screens. Doom scrolling has become a recognized behavioral pattern. We seem drawn to consume stories of human suffering and civilizational collapse with an intensity that suggests something deeper than entertainment. Mark Fisher, the late cultural theorist, called it capitalist realism, the widespread sense that no alternatives to our current system are possible, that we're trapped in cycles of consumption and competition that satisfy no one but CA and be escaped. It's Schopenhauer's will made manifest in economic policy. But the new affirmers are equally visible, equally vocal, and equally convinced they've found the truth. Jordan Peterson rose to international prominence by essentially translating Nietzschean themes for a contemporary audience. Clean up your life, he tells millions of followers. Adopt responsibility for your suffering. Find meaning in your struggles. The popularity of his message, controversial as it is, reveals a hunger for exactly the kind of life affirmation that Nietzsche preached. The Stoic revival represents another stream of neo-Nietzschean thinking. Ryan Holiday's books on ancient philosophy become bestsellers by teaching essentially Nietzschean concepts. Amor Fati rebranded as "The obstacle is the way." The idea that adversity is the raw material for character development. Psychological research has begun validating some surprisingly Nietzschean insights. Post-traumatic growth is now a recognized phenomenon, the discovery that severe adversity can lead to psychological development that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. Anti-fragility, a concept popularized by Nassim Taleb, describes systems that actually gain strength from stress and volatility. Athletic and military training cultures explicitly embrace the Nietzschean principle that suffering voluntarily accepted makes you stronger. Embrace the suck isn't just military slang, it's practical philosophy. The growing popularity of activities like marathon running, mixed martial arts, and extreme sports suggests millions of people instinctively understand that some forms of suffering can be transformative rather than merely painful. Existential psychology, from Viktor Frankl to Irvin Yalom, offers sophisticated versions of Nietzschean meaning-making. Even in concentration camps, Frankl observed, some people found ways to say yes to life by creating purpose from their suffering. The freedom to choose your response to circumstances, the last human freedom, as Frankl called it, is pure Nietzsche translated into therapeutic practice. Walk through any cancer ward, any addiction recovery center, any support group for people who have lost children, and you'll meet people who have somehow transformed their worst experiences into sources of strength and meaning. They didn't choose their suffering, but they chose what to make of it. They found ways to love their fate. But both sides of this contemporary battle have developed toxic mutations that neither Schopenhauer nor Nietzsche would recognize as their own. Toxic positivity has perverted Nietzschean affirmation into a cruel parody of itself. Good vibes only, culture demands that people deny or minimize real suffering in favor of forced optimism. Instagram affirmations that tell people to choose joy, regardless of circumstances, bear no resemblance to amor fati, which requires full acknowledgement of difficulty before choosing to love it. The privilege problem is real. Telling someone in systemic poverty or experiencing genuine oppression to simply choose their response can sound like moral blindness. Nietzsche's philosophy, powerful as it is, can slide into victim blaming when applied carelessly to situations where structural change, not individual attitude adjustment, is what's needed. Meanwhile, intellectual pessimism has its own privilege issues. Antinatalism, climate doomerism, and philosophical nihilism are largely luxury beliefs, positions available mainly to people comfortable enough to contemplate cosmic questions rather than fight for survival. Those struggling to feed their families or escape violence don't have the leisure for existential despair. The social media algorithms that govern much of contemporary discourse reward extreme positions. Nuanced takes on suffering and meaning don't go viral. You're either darker blessed or everything is meaningless. You either think positive thoughts cure cancer, or you believe existence is entirely pointless. We've lost the ability to hold complexity, to acknowledge that both philosophers might have been partially right about different aspects of human experience. The most disturbing possibility is that our current technological environment actively promotes both extremes while making synthesis more difficult. The attention economy that Schopenhauer would have recognized as pure will, insatiable desire for stimulation, creates the very conditions that breed both nihilistic despair and desperate grasping for easy answers. We're conducting a mass psychological experiment, and the results are not reassuring. We have more access to both Schopenhauerian wisdom about suffering and Nietzschean insights about affirmation than any generation before us. We also have more depression, anxiety, and existential confusion. The question both philosophers would ask is obvious. What are we going to do with this knowledge? There's a term that emerged from the concentration camps of World War II, coined by a psychiatrist who had lost everything, his family, his life's work, his homeland, and somehow found a way to say yes to existence anyway. Viktor Frankl called it tragic optimism, the ability to maintain hope and find meaning despite the undeniable reality of suffering, guilt, and death. It's not the optimism that denies darkness exists. It's not the pessimism that surrenders to it. It's something more complex, more mature, and infinitely more difficult, the capacity to hold both truths simultaneously. Schopenhauer got something profoundly right. Suffering is real, pervasive, and often meaningless. The modern psychological concept of the hedonic treadmill validates his insight that achieving our desires rarely brings lasting satisfaction. His observation that we're driven by forces beyond our conscious control has been confirmed by neuroscience, behavioral economics, and depth psychology. More importantly, Schopenhauer's willingness to look directly at suffering without flinching represents a kind of intellectual courage that our culture desperately needs. His compassion emerged precisely from recognizing that all conscious beings share the same fundamental predicament. When you truly understand that everyone is struggling with desires they didn't choose, driven by forces they didn't design, caught in cycles of wanting and disappointment, judgment transforms into empathy. Honest pessimism prevents the kind of naive optimism that causes tremendous harm, the toxic positivity that tells people their depression is a choice, the victim blaming that attributes systemic problems to individual attitude failures, the cruel cheerfulness that refuses to acknowledge real injustice and genuine tragedy. But Nietzsche got something equally important right. The stories we tell ourselves about our suffering shape how we experience it. Pessimism can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, a chosen interpretation that creates the very meaninglessness it claims to discover. Those who find ways to say yes to life, not to its easy pleasures, but to its difficult totality, generally flourish more than those who don't. Psychological research consistently shows that people who create meaning from their adversity experience better mental and physical health outcomes. Post-traumatic growth is real. Resilience can be cultivated. The human capacity for transformation through suffering is extraordinary, but it requires what Nietzsche called courage, the courage to affirm existence even when that affirmation isn't justified by any external authority. Nietzsche's insight about the psychological health of life affirmation has been validated in ways he couldn't have imagined. People who practice gratitude, who find purpose in their struggles, who maintain hope despite evidence that might justify despair, live longer, healthier, more connected lives. But each philosopher also had crucial blind spots that their contemporary followers often inherit. Schopenhauer universalized his own psychological temperament. His pessimism, powerful as it was as a description of certain aspects of existence, became a kind of intellectual pride. He positioned himself as the rare person brave enough to see what others couldn't handle. But this stance prevented him from acknowledging that meaning could be created rather than just discovered. His solution, ascetic withdrawal from the will, was itself a form of willing. He couldn't escape his own system. Even his philosophy of renunciation was driven by desire, the desire to end desire. The saint he praised as the highest human achievement was still choosing, still acting, still participating in the very life process he claimed to have transcended. Nietzsche's philosophy, magnificent as it is, contains its own dangers. Amor fati is extraordinarily difficult, perhaps impossible, for most people in most circumstances. His emphasis on self-overcoming can slide into elitism, creating impossible standards that make ordinary human experience seem insufficient. When Nietzschean ideas are applied carelessly, they can become tools of oppression rather than liberation. Telling someone experiencing genuine injustice that they should love their fate sounds like moral blindness. His philosophy works best for people with enough privilege and resources to have genuine choices about how to interpret their circumstances. Both philosophers, products of their time and temperament, understood only part of the human experience. Neither fully grasped how individual psychology intersects with social structures, how personal meaning-making relates to collective action, how the luxury of philosophical contemplation depends on material security that millions of people lack. But what if we don't have to choose between them? What if the deepest wisdom lies not in synthesis, some comfortable middle ground, but in learning to hold both perspectives dynamically, applying each when appropriate? There are moments that call for Schopenhauerian acceptance. When you're grieving, when you're facing terminal illness, when you're confronting the limitations that define human existence, trying to force affirmation is cruel and counterproductive. Sometimes the wisest response is to acknowledge, this hurts, it should hurt, there's no rushing through it. And any attempt to find immediate meaning or silver lining is a form of violence against your own experience. There are other moments that demand Nietzschean courage. When depression tells you nothing matters, when trauma convinces you you're permanently broken, when circumstances seem to justify complete despair, the ability to choose your response, to create meaning, to say yes to life despite everything, can be literally life-saving. The tragic optimist learns to recognize which approach each situation requires. Grief calls for Schopenhauerian wisdom. Sit with the pain, honor its reality, don't rush toward false comfort. Recovery calls for Nietzschean affirmation. This experience can become raw material for growth, strength, deeper compassion. Even Nietzsche himself, in his final letters before his mental collapse, showed this integration. I have found strength where one does not look for it, in simple, mild, and pleasant people, without the least desire to rule. The philosopher of self-overcoming recognized that ordinary human affirmation, the quiet yes to life of unremarkable people living unremarkable lives with grace, might be the highest achievement of all. The alarm will sound tomorrow morning. Your eyes will open to the familiar ceiling. And in that first moment of consciousness, you'll face the choice that both philosophers understood defines everything that follows. You now know both arguments. Schopenhauer would tell you that your dissatisfaction, your struggles, your sense that something is missing, are evidence of existence's fundamental flaw. The wise response is compassionate acceptance of this tragic condition, perhaps even withdrawal from the game entirely. Nietzsche would tell you that your suffering is the weight that can make you stronger, the resistance necessary for growth, the raw material from which meaning is forged. The courageous response is to say yes, not to easy pleasures, but to the whole difficult, magnificent, terrible, beautiful experience of being alive. Neither can be proven. Both contain truth. You must choose, and you choose every day, consciously or not. Here's the question that cuts through all philosophical abstraction. Would you live your life again? Not a better version, this one, exactly as it happened. Every humiliation, every loss, every moment of boredom and pain, every failure and disappointment, along with every moment of joy, connection, beauty, and love. Schopenhauer would call this question cruel, a kind of torture that only demonstrates the will's sadistic nature. Nietzsche would call it the only question that matters, the test that reveals whether you're truly alive or merely surviving. Your answer, whether you know it or not, is the philosophy you're already living. Tomorrow morning, when you open your eyes and face that first moment of consciousness, that first emotional response to the reality of another day, what will you choose?